hide, nowhere to run.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth podcast, The Moral Economy. Today, we're going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And since it's such a contentious issue, we'd like to introduce a new methodology at looking into this conflict. It's proposed by Andrew, and here's Andrew. He'll get into the approach.
And so I have a new approach because, as Eddie said, this is a very contentious issue. There are lots of feelings that are involved with this. And my approach is based on the credibility spectrum that we introduced a few podcasts ago, which was about how credible information is about global warming. And so how do we choose which information is correct and which information is not correct, or better said, which information is likely to be correct and which information is not likely to be correct. And so I will be introducing my own concept of a credibility map. And on this map, you coordinate along 4 dimensions of credibility. The first dimension is consistency. Then there's expertise, nonconformity, and number. For the first dimension, consistency, you have deductive versus inductive versus abductive logic. And this asks, does the argument follow logically from the premises? Or do the premises give strong but not definitive evidence for the conclusion? So deductive arguments, as two of us are philosophers, we can say they are along the lines of all Zionists are for the state of Israel. Bibi Netanyahu is a Zionist, ergo Bibi Netanyahu is for the state of Israel. Now, this conclusion actually follows from the premises. Because the premises are true, the conclusion is true. However, in this case, while the argument is probably true, earlier the first premise, all Zionists are for the state of Israel, would have been false, since early Zionists were actually for a Jewish state, but not necessarily in historic Palestine. They actually searched all over the world for a place where they could have a Jewish state, in Argentina or in South America.
Madagascar.
Yeah. Then there are inductive arguments. These are arguments along the lines of all Israelis are Jews. This makes sense, though it turns out to be false. There are, in fact, Israeli Arabs. And so inductive reasoning is you would have to go in there and see, are all Israelis actually Jews? No, they're not. There are actually Arabs. And then the third is abductive arguments. These are along the lines of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a religious conflict. These arguments infer a likely explanation that fits some evidence, i.e., that Israelis tend to be Jewish and Palestinians tend to be Muslim, which is true. However, as we all know, this is in fact a conflict over land, resources, and rights, and there are a small but significant groups of non-Jewish Israelis as well as non-Muslim Palestinians. And so, through abductive reasoning, we would think that it's actually a religious conflict, but it's actually not. And these are all subject to 2 criteria: soundness and validity, and falsifiability of theories. Soundness and validity. For soundness, that is the truthfulness of a premise, whereas validity is whether a conclusion logically follows from its premises. A sound and valid argument is said to be a cogent argument, but only for deductive arguments does validity and soundness guarantee truthfulness of the conclusion. So we know that inductive arguments and abductive arguments, while they may actually be sound and valid, they may still nonetheless not be true. For falsifiability, this asks, can a theory be proven wrong, and what are the criteria that would prove its wrongness? So science, as we know, is inductive and relies on falsifiability. And we just have to look at the theory of gravity. We know that the theory of gravity is true, and yet it is still falsifiable. All we have to do is have an instance where two objects do not actually fall at the same acceleration, and then it would be false. But that's never happened, so we accept the theory of gravity. The second part of consistency is cohesion. This asks whether a statement is relevant to a narrative, which asks, does the theory, argument, or statement fit into all sides of a disputed narrative? So not only if it fits into my side, but also if it can also explain what they are saying as well, because a theory wouldn't work if it can also say why they believe the things that they believe. And the criteria of it is Occam's razor. This asks the power of explanation versus simplicity. So you might have an argument that can explain things very well, or a theory that explains things very well, like conspiracy theories. They do that very well, but they're not simple at all. They draw on lots of different phenomena and make only very disconnected conclusions. And then finally, we have public versus private reason. Public reason is free and open reason addressing all. So what we are doing right now is public reason. And it means that I can say something and it is open for scrutiny from all other people. Whereas private reason is narrow instrumental reason addressing one task. This is what you do at a bank when you're counting money or attending the tellers or whatever you're doing. You are applying some sort of logical rule for an end that was either an end to do something or was given to you from somebody else who was over you. And all of these things help us determine whether arguments are credible or not. Less credible arguments are abductive arguments, because you could have a theory that fits a lot of or that explains a lot of phenomena, and yet it's still not true. Most credible are deductive arguments, because as soon as you have validity and soundness, we know that the argument is true. And in the middle, which is going up and down between less and more credible, are inductive arguments. Theory of gravity is a very credible argument, but it's possible that you could have something that explains phenomena, and there's evidence for it, but then it turns out to be false. Which leads into our second dimension, expertise. This dimension has first academic, the first part of it is academic versus financial. Academic versus financial, in which we ask ourselves to which extent is the person's knowledge a product of academic pursuits, and to which degree is it a product of seeking financial gain. In other words, getting a sense of accumulating knowledge as a means to understanding, i.e. as an end in itself, versus as a means to financial end, which goes back to what we were saying before of public versus private reason. Evidence for academic versus financial are degrees and concentrations. These give us a sense of whether the person's expertise is relevant and comprehensive, as well as cost-benefit analysis, which gives us a sense of whether what is being said furthers the financial or hegemonic interests of an individual. So are you saying it because you get money for this? I mean, we go back to oil companies saying that there's no global warming, well, they would say that, wouldn't they?
They have vested interests.
Yeah, they have vested interests. The second part is field experience. This is very self-explanatory, actually. We ask ourselves to which extent is the person actually engaged in their field of expertise. And criteria for this are teaching and research, which asks simply whether the person in question is in a role in furthering understanding of the subject through the dissemination of information. So is this person teaching? Is this person doing research? Because as we all know, when you teach and do research, you gain a better understanding of a subject. And the second is mastery. Again, self-explanatory. It asks how long the person has been engaged in the subject. How many years? How long have they been a teacher? How long have they been a professor? How long have they been a researcher? I've only been a researcher since June, so maybe I'm not so credible, right? Then the third part is institutional versus individual expertise. Institutional versus individual asks whether the person is backed by academic institutions or working for private interest. Universities and societies like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and National Academy of Sciences are academic institutions comprised of individuals working together and backing each other. The question is whether there are internal rules of accountability and review. Whereas examples such as Wikipedia, Reddit, and this podcast may be institutions of sorts and even academic in nature, but there is little or no accountability and review is highly subjective. And you guys are very subjective.
Thank you.
And so with this, we can get a sense of this dimension. The individual layperson is less credible. That's us. We are individual lay people. Whereas the publishing peer-reviewed expert is the most credible. That's because they are controlled or held accountable through institutions that look to see if what they are saying is true or not. And in the middle are non-publishing experts, and these can be people who are very knowledgeable in a specific field, but aren't publishing and aren't subject to review, and therefore are not held accountable. The third dimension is nonconformity. Nonconformity has bias as one of its parts, which asks whether the statement in question is a result of subjective beliefs or financial incentive. Bias has two categories: in-group bias versus out-group. In-group bias supports the views of a group, whereas out-group bias is against another group. And then it has positive versus negative bias. Positive bias is bias as we know it, that which is subjective and incentivized, while negative bias goes against our own subjective incentives. So if an oil company were to say that there is global warming, there's a good reason to believe that that oil company is speaking the truth. The second part is categorical thinking. This asks whether a statement follows from accepted categories, or what I call buckets, which shape how we see the world. And this has two parts as well: inline versus outline thinking. Inline thinking is merely conventionally accepted thought, whereas outline thinking is what we call thinking outside of the box, i.e. unconventional thinking that follows from its own logical merit and not whether it is accepted. And this plays with the whole idea of the nonconformist conformist, i.e. the person who is skeptical to the point that their positions are merely anti-norm and therefore predicted by the norm and therefore conformist. The second part to this is buckets versus spectrums. which asks to which degree a statement recognizes blurred lines between reductive categories, as a statement might very well make categorical sense and nonetheless include limitations as to where the categorical thinking no longer implies. And this plays with tensions between the usefulness of reductionism and the imperative of holism. Reductive categories help us understand clocks, but are limited when it comes to complex systems such as human societies. And just to explain this a little more, a reductive category is something like the color blue. We can all probably agree that something is blue until it approaches something to looking green, right? And so where does this category of blueness end, and where does the category of greenness begin? And these are very blurred lines. Then the third part is pressure. And the pressure, it consists of either social or financial pressures, which I think seem pretty self-explanatory. You have social pressures such as religion and culture, which make you do things because of the consequences of not doing these things. And then you have financial pressures, which again make you do things because of the financial consequences of not doing those things. And with all of this, we get a sense of credibility where pressured bias is less credible. You know, if you are being coerced or you know the consequences of doing something even though it's right, and you do the wrong thing there because of that, then it's less credible. More credible is negative bias with outline spectrums. That means a person who goes against their own bias, so their own incentives, and uses outside of the box thinking and recognizes that their thinking, while it's in categories, these categories only go so far. So you take all these things into account. And in between that is just spectrum thinking. Spectrum thinking, yes, it's great to recognize that categories go only so far, but it's never a sure way of saying whether something is credible or not. And then finally, we have the dimension of number, which is probably the most self-explanatory dimension. This is easy. It's whether it's a single individual or an entire group of individuals who are saying a statement. The thing with a group of individuals is wisdom of the crowds, which means that you can have a group of semi-experts who often reach a more accurate conclusion than any single expert. And then you have also a tool called traveling salespersons. This means the application of a small set of rules to a large group creates information efficiencies, such as when many people traveling between different cities find the shortest paths. And these are two very, very powerful tools for finding knowledge in actually very easy ways. The second part of this is deliberative versus methodological. This asks whether a conclusion was reached through a process of debate in which individuals inform themselves and change their opinions, or whether a conclusion is reached through a mere aggregation of their behaviors. And so are you just reaching this conclusion because you see that all individuals act this way and therefore that's how people should act? Or are you reaching it because, you know, a group of individuals came together, discussed it, and said, we should act this way, and then that's how we should act? This has the process of debate and reductionist argumentation as its parts. Then the final part is democratic versus self-interested. Non-hierarchical groups are more likely to use public reasoning even when following private interests. So when it's democratic, for instance, a WSDE, a worker self-directed enterprise, they are following private reason or using private reason to do private interests, but they're nonetheless using public reasoning in order to achieve their ends, or more likely to use public reasoning to achieve their ends. So they're more likely to say, no, we shouldn't have asbestos in insulation in houses. yes, there is global warming and we are the causes of it, or decides whether they should have higher salary versus higher prices for the consumers. And then, of course, you have power seeking. Power seeking quells the use of public reasoning, turning it into private interest. So in a traditional firm, or let's say a university, academics often use public reasoning, but because they are being used as tools for private power-seeking individuals, their public reasoning becomes private interest and private reasoning. And all of this gives us, again, a sense of what is more credible. Individual reductionist power-seeking is less credible for obvious reasons. Group non-hierarchical wisdom of the crowds is more credible, again, I think for obvious reasons. And groups are in the middle. We don't know. A group can be very credible because they have a lot of discussion, but they can still nonetheless be wrong. And so where does this bring us? One person that we all listen to, even if we don't all like him, is Noam Chomsky. And he has a lot to say about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And so we have to assess how credible Noam Chomsky is. He is decidedly nonconformist. What he says goes against mainstream academia in lots of ways, and he gets threats for what he says.
He's even Jewish.
Yeah, and he's even Jewish. He's, however, only one person. So that already makes him less credible than a group of Chomskys or a group of individuals. However, he is often very consistent. He uses very, very good tools of logic, mostly deductive reasoning, some inductive reasoning, very little abductive reasoning in what he is saying. Again, this is not a reason to say that he's right, but it's a reason to think that he could be right. And finally, the question of expertise. Well, where is Chomsky on expertise? He is very knowledgeable about what he says, about Zionism, about Israel, and yet he's a linguist. That was his profession. That was his first profession. And so I've put him in the middle. It's a question whether his expertise or whether his knowledgeability means expertise or not. And so we could maybe, this is probably bullshit, we could maybe calculate these coordinates, find the area of this trapezoid, it looks like a triangle, but it would be a trapezoid, and determine credibility, at least to the extent that we can have some idea of whether someone is credible or not. And Chomsky, I would say, for an individual, is very credible. And that is my bit.
Cool. Well done. Good shit. You know, I would say though about his credibility.
Heaven should notice, it's everyone, and we're coming for you. It can't be undone, won't be undone. We're gonna occupy your street, your house, your bank accounts, your everything, yes everything. Oh, we're here to occupy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moral Economy Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Eddie Giuseppe.
I am Andrew Fassett.
I'm Navaz.
And I'm Chow. I'm also a host tonight.
I think we're all hosts.
Yeah, we're all hosts tonight.
Yeah.
There's no panel tonight. So Eddie?
Yeah, so we're going to start our talk. Maybe this will be the only topic on our talk today about Palestine and Israel.
And in recent weeks, there's been questions of whether there's a third intifada in Palestine, and violence has increased among the Palestinians and Israelis with knife stabbings on both sides.
There's a video we're going to post in a minute about an imam in Palestine promoting stabbing violence. And for some, that's maybe the cause for this. But other commentators mention how recently, in the past, few months, that restrictions have been established to the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Yeah.
This is the third most important Islamic site. And some restrictions are going up to the age of 50. So if you're a male and under the age of 50 or 45, you do not have access anymore of Al-Aqsa, which is located, of course, in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and that's accompanied by news that in the past month, since October 1st, 58 people on the Palestinian side have been killed.
And about maybe a dozen, I want to say, Israelis,
Yeah.
Jewish Israelis.
Yeah.
What I want to mention, which is pretty crazy, is that all of these stabbings have been uncoordinated, it seems. Just random acts. And they've also been done by Israeli Arabs.
Yeah, Israeli Arabs.
Yeah, but I think what's more important in terms of the Imam's fatwa that you sort of talk about, I think that is probably one of the reasons behind it. Because the conflict's taken such an localized aspect this time. So probably the Imam had that in mind and how he could sort of mobilize people to resist and stand up against
The occupation.
yeah. More
oppression.
recently being denied to pray or worship at one
Yeah,
of the
but I mean, at what cost?
most
I
holy
mean, at what
sites.
cost is this? Because if they start resisting in that way, with stabbings, they're seeing that there's just a backlash against it, right?
Well, that's what's interesting. I think we see it as a backlash, these stabbings, at least because of the occupation. But how many commentators are framing it is that, oh, look at these, these people, they're committing violence on Israelis. And Israel has then the justification,
Yeah, the higher ground.
to defend themselves, which of course,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a little
Which
more
it gets
defense.
into this whole point of what Netanyahu said just last week, that Hitler didn't want to exterminate all the Jews until he was visited by
the Mufti of,
Palestinian Mufti.
Mufti of
Palestinian-
Jerusalem.
Yeah, the Mufti of Jerusalem was behind
Mufti,
convincing Hitler.
who convinced Hitler to actually exterminate Jews because Hitler just wanted to expel them.
Which historically is not accepted by any
Yeah.
Absolutely.
historian.
None of the Holocaust
And
historians.
so Merkel
speak to such a view.
made a direct statement to that, saying that Germany was responsible for that at that time, and that it needs to be taught everywhere. That is the real history.
Yeah, that's, I think, concerning to see that Netanyahu would go so far as to condone some kind of
Yeah.
fringe historical theory, which to me seems as a further push to justify Israeli violence on Palestinians.
Yeah.
Which is really a concern. I mean,
Yeah, we were watching this video recently tonight on Democracy Now! About the Israeli. So he's the rabbi of this one group.
Rabbis for Peace.
Yeah, Rabbis for Peace. Actually being attacked by someone with a knife, because he was trying to capture film of Israelis stealing olives from.
No, it was settlers burning a Palestinian olive trees.
Yeah.
And it's important to
Yeah.
note that this rabbi was attacked by a hooded Israeli extremist.
Assailant, yeah.
I think it's really important that we touched on Netanyahu going public about implicating Palestinians in one of the biggest crimes that was committed against the Jews in human history to somehow, I don't know, get political capital out of it, or to somehow, make people touch base, sort of with the people that, Palestinians are somehow responsible for their condition.
Yeah.
I mean, I see that as almost, as a way to also influence the United States, because of the right wing in the United States supports Israel, and they're already, very suspect about Muslims, and so if they heard that the Palestinians Muslims were responsible for the biggest genocide that's ever occurred, then that would sway them even more.
I mean, there's so much rhetoric coming out of this region that takes the form of like, who started it? For me, this is the part. This is probably the most frustrating part of this conflict.
Yeah.
And it comes from both sides, both from the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. I mean, whenever you get into like discussions about, this conflict, people usually start turning to historical fact, and they start saying, okay, but on this so and so date, this happened, and then the Palestinians did this, and they started it, but then somebody will counter with, but actually before that, Israel did this, and then Israel started it.
Yeah.
But I really find that this is an extremely flawed sort of logic. I mean, this is playground logic. I mean, the kid on the playground who punches the other kid always says, well, he started it.
Yeah.
And you're never going to actually resolve a conflict if you constrain if you limit your rhetoric about it to who started it 50 years ago. And it seems like in this case with Netanyahu, it's just he's taking it one step further into the history. Well, it was the Palestinians that caused the Holocaust. They started the whole thing,
Yeah. And it somehow sidesteps the whole, the biggest issue on the Palestinian side of it, which is primarily about, the settlers coming in their land and, taking over the territory which is owned by them. This is what Netanyahu's rhetoric just sidesteps completely, because at least the conflict, at least in the Palestinian prism, is framed in this manner, in a manner of control over their territories, over their living spaces.
The politics.
Yeah, of course. I mean, their statehood, their politics, all of that, and this very carefully, very intelligently, somehow just sidesteps it.
Yeah. And it also sidesteps the issue of, I mean, how are we going to resolve this conflict? Because you can't resolve the conflict if you're constantly just pointing fingers and being like, oh, but he started it again. And every time, and it repeats itself every time the conflict breaks out anew. Then it's always somebody else who started it. I mean, Palestine will say, yeah, well, Israel's occupying us and this is terrible, and so they started this and we're defending ourselves. And then Israel says, yeah, but the Palestinians killed an Israeli, so they started this. And it's like, yeah, but if you keep talking along these lines, then you're never gonna move forward.
But to me, that's exactly what Israel wants. They want the status quo to continue because they keep taking over Palestinian land. So this is actually in their favor. I mean,
but Professor Sapolsky, who does the human behavioral biology lectures and YouTube at Stanford University, he mentioned has a deeper sort of symbolism to it. That hardcore Israeli generals say of the Palestinians, yes, we would relinquish a few, we would let them have more rights and stuff if they would realize, they would stop with this anti-Semitic symbolism, and then the Palestinians counter or say also, yeah, we would also stop having this anti-Semitic stuff if they would recognize that we were here first. And so it's because they're not respecting the symbolism on both sides that they actually perpetuate things and start saying, okay, you did this and you did this and you did this. Because when it's only two symbols that they're fighting for, then it's hard to determine which one was prior to the other.
That's right.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, for me, I don't know. I haven't seen anything that's convinced me otherwise that it's just not, Israeli politics to continue the way they're going. Because eventually, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, it's occupation now in Palestine is so bad. The fact that the West Bank and Gaza are separated, the idea of a two-state solution seems already far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's gonna happen. I mean,
Yeah.
we were surprised by this in CNN. That CNN was it CNN that showed
MSNBC.
MSNBC
Yeah, the map of
showed an actual map
Palestine.
of
With-
Palestine over from the
Past 60
1970
years, yeah. From
Yeah.
about 1947,
47.
47
since
war.
establishment of the State of Israel, to
Oh, yeah.
up till now. And they later took it off, saying that it was their mistake.
Yeah, I've seen that map before.
Yeah.
I've seen that map before. Yeah, it's unbelievable. Israeli argument is that since Palestine is not a state, the settlements that they're establishing are totally legal.
I mean, Palestine does own some of the responsibility in this conflict, and also, the powers that be in Palestine do, I believe, they do think strategically. When they do things like put rocket launchers on hospitals and schools. They hope that Israel bombs those hospitals and schools because that strengthens their position internationally. They say, look at these war crimes that Israel is committing. And they're
Yeah, but
I would say that
I've heard and read that the evidence for them actually doing that is very scant.
Not only that, how about the whole conversation that the powers that be in Palestine have
Any power at all.
Well, not only that, but those that do have some power, they are in cahoots with the Israeli government.
Yeah,
I mean,
they've agreed with the Israelis. They've done everything that they've wanted them to do, and even though that they came out of movements that were Palestinian movements for freedom, like the PLL.
And also, I mean, when we talk of this, I mean, I think Shell made a very good point that does, in one way, play them, act them as the victims of the war.
Yeah.
But if you look at the imbalance in the war, I don't think it's probably something that they would resort to. I mean, they just don't have the equipment.
I guess someone would resort to
Yeah. They don't have the equipment, the training that the Israeli military has. It's one of the top equipped and well trained militaries, well funded militaries in the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, of course, even if Palestine is purposefully putting, rocket launchers on top of schools, hoping that Israel bombs the schools, that in no way justifies Israel's decision to bomb that school. I mean, Israel says, oh, but they're shooting rockets at us. But it's also okay, but I mean, this is scary. Rockets are scary. Rockets kill people. They're terrifying. And I would hate to live in a country that I'm constantly under the threat of being hit by a rocket. On the other hand, the number of rockets fired, proportional to the number of rockets that actually do any damage, it's really, really, really small. And if you bomb a school, the chance that you're going to kill a bunch of kids is really, really, really high. So it's okay, so let's do a little bit. I mean, doing math in such a situation, seems to be completely inappropriate. But let's do a little bit of math, right? Let's say that you shoot 50 missiles from the top of that school. Let's say of those 50 missiles, 0 missiles hit and kill anybody. Let's say we bomb that school, we kill 50 kids. Was that a good decision? I mean, was that a morally acceptable decision? I mean, I think that would require further justification, to put it diplomatically. I don't. Israel has the choice to say no. And honestly, in the end, for me, going back to the idea that that the rhetoric is all about who started it. In the end, if we're going to move forward, somebody has to take that first step and say, listen, Palestine, if you shoot missiles at me, I'm not going to bomb the school. I'm not going to bomb the school.
I mean, to me, the question is, Israel wants this to continue.
Yeah.
And so the next question would be, okay, what's to be done? Knowing that, Israel takes this very realpolitik stance. They don't care if...
Yeah, Machiavellian.
Sure. And so what to do? I mean, as an international community, what to do? That's why I'm a big supporter of boycott and divesting Israel.
Well, I know. I mean, the first thing we could do is, as the United States could stop funding them by giving them weapons.
Absolutely.
And,
I agree.
and $3 billion a year for their army.
It's illegal.
But what can I do? I'm an American citizen. What, I just call my representative and say, hey, stop.
Yeah,
supporting Israel?
I mean, we need to have a movement for that. But I mean, that would be the single fastest thing to do.
Yeah.
Boycott and the BDS movement against Israel is very effective against Israel. And we're going to post a link to it on our page. I mean, that's the only movement I see that's doing anything.
I think before that, it needs to be also identified that this wrong is being committed. The narrative in the global north, so to speak, is way different, as you would hear it in the.
But that's what I was talking about the symbolism. We need to actually admit. At least both sides, or hopefully both sides, at least start with one side, admits the wrongs against the Palestinians for having their land taken away. It admits the
Exactly.
wrongs against the Israelis for the anti-Semitism.
Exactly, it's a part of mutual recognition.
Yeah.
Both sides have to admit the legitimacy of the other side's concerns and complaints.
Yeah.
I mean, because they both have legitimate complaints.
Yeah.
You know, and both sides need to recognize those. You know.
I mean, the biggest hope is that somehow Netanyahu gets out of office.
Well, he just got re-elected. That's
Yeah,
not happening.
It's not happening, right? But
But it's important to know there are Israeli Jews that are against what the state
yeah,
of Israel
there
is doing.
are. I mean, there are actually big groups of academics who are very against what Israel is doing to Palestine, and they have lots of problems because of that.
Yeah, sure. That's another topic.
That's the thing. Yeah, that's what I'm talking. Because the debate is framed in such sensitive manner. If you talk about Israel, you're being an anti-Semite of sorts.
Right.
And that
Or
matters.
self-hating Jew if you're Jewish.
That's
No,
what's
I mean, yeah,
shit out of a lot of people.
Zizek was talking about how they've actually become the hardline right-wing Israelis themselves have become the real anti-Semitics, calling the ones who are against killing the Palestinians, the ones who are against the occupation, all the same names that the Nazis had called the Jews during that time. And it's really, really fucked up stuff.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it also destabilizes the region. I mean, it makes the security situation for Israel worse. In the long term, because I mean, that whole region is pretty much anti-Israel. And it seems to me that if Israel really cares about its own existential, its
well-being,
well-being, its right to exist, all of these things, then it shouldn't antagonize all of its neighbors, especially over.
I think that's part of the game, though.
Yeah, but
because they are in that precarious position, they have the excuse to receive all this funding from the U.S. What is it, $2 billion a year?
Yeah, but let's remember
to be one of the most powerful military states in the world.
Let's remember that lots of the ones.
I think I want to make a further point on the U.S. foreign policy in the region. I think U.S. foreign policy, at least post World War II or even post Cold War, in the Middle East has been taken this fact as taken that Israel is a state to support over there, ensure America's interests in the region. Israel is the biggest military. It's the only nuclear power, which is why it was the big thing with Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, the mullahs in Iran would come and like Ahmadinejad, what he did, threaten Israel with the nukes and all that. That is the narrative that they take for them, having this military advantage, like the funding that the United States government does to the Israeli military goes on to serve that advantage that Israel has, and this keeps reproducing itself.
Mm.
So the more you strengthen Israel, the more you tip the balance of power in the region. And Iran, if you should look at it in that respect, Iran was the only power in the region that could. I mean, Saudi Arabia is essentially an American ally. They have it okay with the Israelis. Never does the Imam of Kaaba.
Here are actually two really good points, I think. That one, we have to remember that the countries in the Middle East that have the best relations with Israel are also the ones that the United States is sending weapons to. And two, that we have Iran, which is sort of it's been seen as opposing Saudi Arabia, which is the power, the Islam power in the region. And Saudi Arabia is the one that is backed by the United States.
That is why Iran gets to play its politics in the region, with Hezbollah and their Shia proxies, and that is what brings Saudi Arabia and Israel together. You see how it's disconnected with the whole American foreign policy.
Yeah, but doesn't realism dictate that if you build weapons, your neighbors will build weapons? I mean, the whole arms race thing is
of course
deductive in realism.
Yeah,
so this is a short term. This lacks all long term.
That's why
Israel is if their whole policy is we want to be this big military power. Well, fast forward 100 years. I mean, when somebody else gets a nuclear weapon or is capable of building an army that can stand its own against Israel, then suddenly Israel's in a much worse situation. Maybe right now in the short term they're like, we got the biggest military, nobody can really mess with us. But that's only right now. Things change. You know, and it won't be that long before
Yeah.
somebody's like, and Israel, remember all those years that you really pissed us off? Well, guess what? We got nukes now. And by the way, you have a really
actually,
small
maybe
country.
that's the importance
exactly,
of destabilizing
yeah.
the region.
Yeah,
Is that so this takes longer
no one
to.
other state.
That's the whole point.
And also
Right.
the whole thing with what happens is you keep there was a change of regime after the Arab Spring in the north of Africa, Egypt, and then the military comes in, and the military is being supported by the United States. So that again goes on bringing Egypt as a client state back to the U.S. And it's the U.S. that's somehow tipping Israel above the other countries in the region. And the only contender in the short run even, Chell, was, I think, Iran. And that has been nipped in the bud with, crippling sanctions for about, 20 years now.
Yeah, but there's no way to guarantee this as a long-term
I
policy.
wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that, yeah.
And
I mean,
so,
But I
definitely.
think that's the logic in general. I mean, it's the short term. It's
Yeah, but it's so
the bottom
flawed,
line.
you know?
Of course.
I mean, it's so extremely flawed, and it's just going to lead to these cycles, these endless cycles of violence, until one day somebody, gets a couple nukes into Israel, man.
Yeah.
And I mean, then what happens, right?
Well,
and
I
it
mean,
seems to me like if you just changed your approach a little bit here, let's make love, not war, guys, right? I mean, this guarantees security, because if your neighbors really like you and you're a profitable trade partner and you get along and these sort of things, well, then you're in a much safer situation because nobody, thinks about killing you all the time.
Yeah,
I
but the
wonder
cost
then-
of losing maybe the
I
U.S. as a
wonder
trade
then-
partner, right?
is if security is the aim. Are they just making a bad calculation, or are we assuming that security is the aim?
I don't think security.
Again,
is the aim.
if you take Chell's realist perspective, then in the realist perspective, it's really not like this, we all, just love each other and don't make war. It's all about, having more and more power, dominating more and more of the scene.
That's
Yeah,
what
yeah.
I'm
So
But
the rationalist calculus in U.S. is pretty much on the track. They have their cards played well. Israel has to be the region, the military power in the region. Iran, we do a nuclear deal with them, despite what the neocons tell us, despite what the right wing tells us, despite what Israel tells us. We shut down their program. We don't let them come out as a credible, capable challenger to Israel.
Yeah, but
Iraq tried to do that, another historical fact, and their reactors were taken off. And then Saddam is gone, and now the country is a mess.
Yeah, but this realist logic loops back on itself. Like it never will actually accomplish the things that it wants to accomplish. Because in the end, if the goal is to get more power, then once again, fast forward 100 years. When you have another country that's a rival in power, then you're threatened existentially, and this time really threatened existentially. And then if you were to be destroyed, you would have zero power. And so, I mean, what kind of calculus is this? What kind of logic is this?
Well, it's always short-term calculus, right?
Yeah, but
I mean, that's the whole
Yeah.
system, all capitalism, all these war industrial complex,
Military
and military industrial complex. It's all for short-term gain.
Yeah.
The bottom line.
So you can always start a conflict somewhere, get in, have short-term military gain, get out again before it becomes too costly, and then wait for the next conflict, which is going to happen because you've already
set the stage
destabilized.
for it,
Yeah.
This is a logic, I think, that permeates
True. Yeah.
capitalist society
Yeah.
ever since 18th century. 19th century.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could do even just a podcast about that. I mean, this kind of
Definitely.
rationality,
How
this
the
bottom.
war feeds industry and profits.
Yeah, and realism, just the dangers of realism. I think that would
Oh,
be
yeah,
a
that's
great
very
podcast.
important,
The reductivist, realist, rationalist
Yeah,
paradigm
like-
that we
like,
live in is terrible.
What's his
Yeah.
face?
And what we could do to counter that,
Yeah,
culturally speaking.
Yeah,
Who was the Secretary
politically
of State during the Cold War?
Kissinger.
Kissinger.
Henry
He was
Kissinger.
a real realist.
Yeah.
Oh, big
Yeah.
time.
I mean,
I mean, most to
of the
this
American
day
foreign
are
policy has
realists,
been
you know?
drafted by him. Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, you see some, the other way. What is it? The constructivists. I guess they're the
Yeah.
main camp that
Yeah.
opposes the
Yes,
realists.
yeah.
And I think that they have made gains, and I think that they are a viable. I mean, the constructivists basically say if we agree to something, we can actually hold on to that agreement. We can agree to be friends, and it will become that way. Whereas the realists say, no, it will never really be that
Right.
way because you'll always secretly be.
Yeah,
army,
well, look how game theory says, it makes the realist argument, right?
Right.
You can never get past the prisoner's dilemma because you'll never be sure that your partner is going to actually cooperate or not.
Yeah, I mean,
And so
game theory is the realists' golden egg. I mean,
Right.
they pooped that crap out and used it as justification for their own, their pre-existing biases.
Well, where real game theory, when you do it like over multiple generations, takes the constructivist view, because it does a tit for tat, so that if
Really,
you
that's right.
start out nice, the other person will also do nice on the basis of that agreement.
Yeah.
And as soon as they do something bad, you do something bad in response.
Yeah. But it's
And
rational to keep doing the nice thing.
And then you have a
it is.
forgiving element where you do a nice thing again and see if they respond with a nice thing.
Yeah.
And so a forgiving tit for tat actually beats out all other systems.
Yeah, and that would definitely be based on constructivist approach, because it would involve treaties and talking and negotiation.
And the problem with that is, though, you can only know, or you're not allowed to know how many games there are, because as soon as you know how many games you are, you can do the calculation in your head, start from the last game, what do I want to win with that, so what do I have to do all along the chain. Each side has to think there's always going to be more games.
Yeah, because in the last iteration, according to Prisoner's Dilemma, you should then defect.
Yeah.
But
That's
if
why
there's no last iteration, then
I think that's why some would say the use, socially speaking, of religion. The idea that you do it because even in the future, after your death, you will be promised some kind of gain.
Yeah.
I mean, religion is kind of constructivist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a topic.
With many religions, at least. Right? Abrahamic religions, even Buddhism with karma. You do it now because some new life. There's Hinduism as well. Isn't that interesting, huh?
Yeah.
I guess Marx was right in that sense. It's the opiate
Of the masses. Yeah.
Cheers.
That's true that.
So we'll come back.
I say we will finish up this podcast, and next week
we come back with the series of leaks by the Intercept on the workings of the drones, the drone warfare by the United States.
All right, that sounds good.
Cool.
See you.
Yeah.
All right, hear you guys then.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks
For
for
listening.
watching
Listening. Yeah.
and all that good stuff.
Participating. Yeah. And
Juicy.
write
Ciao.
comments and subscribe.
Hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey ho, hey. We're here to occupy. I know it, feel it's time. We occupy, occupy. I reckon it's a revolution. Oh yeah, I know it, feel it's time. It's time we occupy, occupy. I reckon it's a revolution.
And welcome to our podcast, the Moral Economicus podcast.
Welcome to the moral economy.
Podcast.
I was about to say, welcome to democracy.
Okay, let's start this one over, right?
Yeah, let's start over. Can you do the work, Ricky?